What are shadow and zombie APIs? We'll look into this in today's video. We'll explain those terms and we also look at why they even exist. And it's important to know what these APIs are because they are creating security risks. And since we have more and more APIs in organizations, we will see these APIs becoming more and more prevalent, and it becomes important that we understand where they come from so that we can better identify and manage them. The underlying story really is that of the fact that the API space is growing a lot because we want to connect more and more systems, we digitalize more and more things, which just creates more and more APIs. And that's good because we want to connect things, we want to digitalize things, we want to build new experiences around digital capabilities. But we also create risk with that, and we have to become better at managing that risk, and this is what today's video is all about. Let's jump right in. What are shadow APIs? Shadow APIs borrow their name from shadow IT. This IT that is created somewhere off the usual path, where people just get stuff done and don't really do it the way that it should be done. And APIs can do the same thing, and then they become shadow APIs. There are two main reasons why shadow API exists. One is that these are private APIs which are created for just use within the organization. And the assumption is that they will only be used internally within the organization's network between two applications of the organization. And then a lot of times people assume, well, in that case, we don't have to really properly manage them. And it's not something that has to go through this more, I would say, intentional idea of opening up something by creating an API for consumption that either is by an external party or that has to be exposed externally in some shape or form. But this API still exists and is a possible point of attack, so that's a problem. The second reason why APIs can become shadow APIs is because they're not even identified as APIs. And a lot of stories around API breaches actually originate this way. A very typical case here is that somebody creates an app, and this app runs on phones, any kind of device. And then because the phones can be anywhere, this app needs to talk to the API in the organization. And that happens through an API. So technically it's an API. But it is amazing to see how often this kind of setup is created and people are not aware of the fact that they have created an API. For them, it's just they've created an app that happens to talk to the server. But this connection is something that can be misused when it's not properly managed. So this needs to be treated as an API. And if it's not, then it becomes this risk. And like I said, a lot of stories around security problems with APIs actually are coming from this area. If we look at what shadow APIs look like in our architecture, it looks in a very simplified way like this. We have the preferred way how we do API management. In many cases, this probably uses components such as API gateways, maybe even multiple gateways, depending on where APIs get published. But there are components which are responsible for managing the APIs. And your typical APIs will go through this infrastructure. They will be managed through this API management. The API management then is controlled by API governance, where there are certain rules being put in place, how we treat, for example, different types of APIs. And all of this works well. This is how we do it. But then the shadow APIs are somewhere in the shadows to the side, and they don't go through this because either they haven't been identified as APIs, or somebody said, oh, how bad can it be? It's just for internal use. And in both of these cases, you now have a risk because the API is not managed as it should be, and therefore it's much easier to attack and can be abused. So we see these APIs relatively often, actually. Now let's jump to our second set of problematic APIs, which are the zombie APIs. What are zombie APIs? Zombie APIs can be two types of APIs. One type that is also relatively frequent is unused APIs. So these are APIs that were created at some point, let's say for a migration project, somebody wanted to migrate data from one platform, one application to another, and an API was created that would allow to do that, sync things over time, maybe also for a transitional period. But at some point, things are finished, and in theory, you could now stop the API from functioning. You could just shut it down and say, we don't need this anymore. But it's not done because, well, the transition is done, everybody's happy, and the API is still sitting there. So even though it's not being used, it's there and it's active, and somebody who's probing your servers, who's probing your infrastructure and your network might find it. And if that happens, then you may have a problem, because in particular for these migration scenarios, oftentimes these APIs are very powerful because they provide oftentimes pretty complete access to all the data. And then if somebody misuses that, that's not good. So that's one of the two popular cases of what a zombie API can be. The second case is that there are APIs that are still being used, but it's not quite clear who's managing the infrastructure behind it, the server side, the service implementation, because it may be a project team that no longer exists. It may have been an external party implementing it, and that external party is no longer contracted. There are several ways how this can happen, but the scenario in general is always the same. You have an API that is being used, that is active, that is useful, but if you have to change things, you don't really know how to do that. And then can be a problem as well, because for example, if you realize that this API is exposing certain data that it shouldn't be exposing for privacy reasons or security reasons, then it's now pretty hard to fix it because you don't know who to turn to. So when we look at what zombie APIs look like in our architecture, it's a little bit like this. It's an API that is sitting there, that is being used or can be used, but where it's not quite clear where the service really, how it's managed, who to turn to, or simply I just don't even know that it's still there, in which case it's kind of also a question mark. By the way, keep in mind that APIs also can be both, right? They can be shadow and zombie APIs. So the zombie API may or may not be properly managed from the API side of things. But to be a zombie API, the underlying problem is that it's not quite clear who is actually in charge of the API even being there, and who I could go to if I had to do something with the API, for example, shutting it down because I now realize that it shouldn't even exist anymore, or I have to change it, these kind of things. So now we've seen those problematic two types of APIs. What can we do about them? And this is where it's really important to think about your API management in a holistic kind of way. So don't just think of your API management as something that manages the APIs that you very well know about. Start with the question of which APIs do I even have? And that's not an easy question to answer. It's a question where oftentimes in large organizations, when you ask these questions, you get a lot of head scratching and people are saying, we're not quite sure. And what do you really mean by API? Right? It can be tricky. So step number one for responsible API management is know all your APIs and really know them, and not just the ones that are easy to find, but also the ones that are hard to find. And we see more and more tooling in that space, and that is really, really helpful for this. And I think it just will become a more standard way of API management to not just start with, here are the APIs we're managing, but to start with, what are we even managing? So now that you know all of your APIs, now you can manage them because you know what to manage. That's a good starting point. And then the next step of management also means monitoring them. So not just managing them in terms of securing them in the traditional way, but also identifying suspicious access patterns, unusual access patterns, so that you can more easily spot attacks, abuse, these kind of things. And that is where the management then helps, because now you can actually apply this monitoring to all your APIs, really to all your APIs, and not just to the ones that probably are properly managed anyways. And as the last step, we can now also say, and you also have to be able to identify who is responsible for providing this API on the provider side, so that you can also manage the service, and that you can, for example, then say, okay, it seems like this API is being misused, or it's overexposing data that we really don't have to expose, or that we really shouldn't expose. Who do I go to, for example, to change the API? Or maybe also, who do I go to shut down the API because it shouldn't be used at all? We don't even know who's using it, so we probably should just shut it down. And there are techniques around this, how you can do this. We won't dive into any of this today, but this roughly gives you an idea of how modern API management really should not just look at managing the smaller space of things that you created, but really managing the whole surface of APIs that you have in your organization, which can be sometimes a little bit hard to find, but it's an important step on your API journey. And with that, we're done for today. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope you found it interesting. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing. I'm publishing new videos around APIs all the time. And I hope you found this one interesting. Subscribe for the next one. And until then, see you, and hopefully see you soon. Bye.